and good evening to those of you who, I guess it's evening everywhere now, but it's an honor to be with all of you virtually, and certainly my good friend, Scott Peters. Now, I know in Congress, we throw around that phrase, my good friend, liberally. Sometimes you'll hear us refer to my good friend, the distinguished gentleman from the great state of Texas, or my good friend, the distinguished gentle lady from the great state of New Jersey. And Scott knows, most of the time we use the phrase, my good friend, y'all, we don't mean it. But with Scott Peters, I absolutely mean it for all the reasons that he set forth. But we were classmates, we came into Congress together. And from the very beginning, Scott demonstrated himself to be thoughtful, pragmatic, principled, and aggressive in getting things done for the people who he's privileged to represent in Southern California and for the nation. And so thank you, Scott, for extending this invitation for me to participate with your constituents virtually. These are definitely challenging times, and it's been a very challenging year as we have endeavored to work through the COVID-19 pandemic, both the public health crisis and an economic crisis, and there's still more work to be done. We're going to urge the Senate to pass the HEROES Act so we can provide additional relief to the American people. At the same time, we are grappling with systematic racism as it has manifested itself time and again, often with police officers crossing the line, taking the life of unarmed, innocent, law-abiding African-American men or women. Now, that's not to say that the majority of police officers, certainly who I interact with, are hardworking public servants who are in the community to protect and serve. But at the same time, we cannot deny that there are brutal police officers, there are abusive police officers, there are violent police officers, and there's a corrosive culture far too often that needs to be changed from a warrior mentality to a guardian mentality. And that, in fact, is an approach that is embraced by law enforcement professionals in jurisdiction after jurisdiction. We want to nationalize that. And we want to create accountability so that when an officer does cross the line, just like with everyone else, there are consequences because no one is above the law. And when you have the ability to take someone's life or liberty away, they should be held to precise standards of conduct that allow for the promotion of a great relationship between the police and the community, not a poisonous one that sometimes can result in the loss of life. And so this is an important moment and an important challenge to tackle, not just on behalf of the African-American community, but on behalf of all Americans as we continue our march toward a more perfect union. That's what the Justice in Policing Act is all about. And Scott, I've been heartened lastly by the fact that yes, it's a movement in large measure that has been led by young African-American women and men, young women in particular, and that's been wonderful to see. But at the same time, it's a multiracial movement. We've seen young people of every race, Black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American, multi-generational movement in terms of the expression of concern across all of America, and multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious. That's how we make progress in America. And we're committed to doing that as House Democrats in moving the justice and policing law.
Video how you, sorry. Sorry about that. I wonder, Hakeem, if you'd be willing to share the story of how you first heard about the George Floyd murder. And I know you have a particular story, and maybe how that struck you and your family.
Yeah, no, thank you, Scott. We've all been home and we've all been spending time, of course, with our families. I've got two sons, two teenage boys. Part of the reason why I think this moment is different is that America really was a captive audience in terms of seeing George Floyd murdered and watching him narrate his own death. And it was a troubling video. For me, it was a video that was not brought to me by my chief of staff. It was not brought to me by Scott or a fellow member of Congress. It was not brought to me by my legislative director. It was brought to me by my young teenage son, who showed it to me and said, "Dad, it's happened again. Why does this keep occurring? What are you going to do about it?" And it really was a moment where that went right through your heart as a father, knowing that my young son, who's never been in trouble, has been the best son that we could possibly ask for, as my oldest son has been, in terms of doing the right thing. He's a teenager. We know what teenagers do, but giving us no trouble. But basically, sharing an expression of concern that I knew related to his own well-being and livelihood, because for him, at any moment, his life could be taken unjustifiably. What are we going to do about it? That's why Congress is acting. That's why I'm so thankful for Scott's leadership and his support in this effort.
So is that the difference that you said, that's the difference between this video and other videos? It's not just an accumulation. It was the way it was presented and the fact that we were all kind of captive. You think that was it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, sociologists and historians will study this, but I think it was an accumulation of things. In part, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought a lot of pain and suffering and death throughout America. And we know that that pain, suffering, and death has been experienced by everyone, but disproportionately it has hit the African-American community, the Latino community, the immigrant community, particularly hard. And so I think a lot of folks, even prior to seeing George Floyd murdered on a Minneapolis street, had concluded that there are real ingrained problems and disparities in America that have to be confronted and addressed. And so the foundation had been laid, I think, for a real conversation about meaningful change as a result of the pandemic. And then we're all a captive audience. And we see the video of Ahmaud Arbery, jogging while Black. And then we hear about Breonna Taylor, gunned down, sleeping while Black. And then the finale occurs, of course, when George Floyd is killed, handcuffed while Black. And it's an accumulation, I think, that occurred. And the fact, Scott, as you indicated, we all were a captive audience to process it all, talk about it all with our family members, as I did, but as many American families of every race did, and then conclude that enough is enough. We've got to do something about this.
Yeah, I just observed that that in my community, which is, we don't have a large African-American population, people were moved by this, and it reflected that it was a sort of this, almost the same event as Eric Garner, a defenseless person for no apparent reason, for obviously for no reason, losing his life. But it's affected people in our community here in a way that I haven't seen before. And I wonder, just finally, I'm going to ask you another question. Maybe we have time for a couple questions from the constituents, but you have that national enthusiasm for reform now, a national interest in reform. How do you think we are going to harness that enthusiasm across the country to make changes that will be meaningful, about how we provide public safety for our communities?
The president took a modest step today, which at least suggests to me that even Donald Trump understands that something has to happen. Now, it was a modest step, nowhere close to what needs to happen legislatively to permanently make change, but it's an indication coming from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, despite his inclinations to do nothing, to inflame and to divide, and to blindly defend those who cross the line, even if they're wearing a uniform. He's going to blindly defend those who cross the line. That even Donald Trump recognized that he needed to step forward and show some semblance of leadership, not nearly enough. But we do know that in the House Judiciary Committee hearing last week, many of us were pleasantly surprised that our Republican colleagues expressed support for a variety of things, like criminalizing the chokehold or establishing a national database so that a officer who was fired for aggressive use of force complaints repeatedly happening can't then be hired by the neighboring jurisdiction because they have no visibility into his disciplinary record. That occurred with Tamir Rice, where an officer gunned down a 12-year-old boy who was playing in a park. That officer had been fired by a neighboring police department for engaging in violence.
Right.
But the Cleveland Police Department hired him because it had no visibility. So our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, in part, have expressed support for that. And that was part of Trump's executive order today. We even had a Republican colleague say qualified immunity as a doctrine shouldn't exist because it prevents accountability. And in America, you can't have a right without a remedy. And you have civil rights laws on the books that can't be enforced because qualified immunity exists. Shocked us all because it came from the other side of the aisle. And so hopefully what we're seeing is because the American people are saying change is necessary in such an overwhelming way that our Republican colleagues will be compelled to act.
Thank you, Hakeem. Marianne, we have Hakeem for another 5 minutes or so. Do you? I think he's got. You have a question that one of the constituents has for him.
I do. We have a question from Jeremy, who says he lives in District 2 here in San Diego. His question is that he's concerned about how the symbiotic relationships between police, district attorneys, coroners, judges, prosecutors result in injustice and a lack of accountability for police officers because they're colleagues and they work with each other all the time. He's wondering if there's legislation that Congress can pass that could address this. And maybe the proposals that are on the board right now in the House of Representatives might address this problem.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and Jeremy, that is part of the heart of the problem. What we saw with the Eric Garner case, for instance, that Scott referenced, is that as an individual, he, said, "I can't breathe" 11 times, was not resisting, and was choked to death with a maneuver that the police department in New York itself had banned. And yet the DA didn't aggressively present that case to a grand jury, and a grand jury didn't indict, in part because of the cozy relationship between the DA, who went on to serve in Congress, and of course, the police department, because they do have a symbiotic relationship. And so one of the reasons why our bill expands jurisdiction for the Department of Justice Office of Civil Rights and gives the Office of Civil Rights independent subpoena power is because we need to create independent investigatory authority outside of the local district attorney. And the Justice and Policing Act also would empower the state attorney generals across the nation, who are also one step removed from the local DAs, to have investigatory authority as well, so we can have some accountability. And let me express thanks, Scott, for the leadership of Chairwoman Karen Bass. I know I'm her warm-up act today, and it's always a blessing to serve as her warm-up act, but she's a great friend of ours and a phenomenal member who's done a tremendous job on the Justice and Policing Act.
Hakeem, I can't tell you how much I appreciate seeing you. It's nice to see you. I miss seeing you in person. Thanks so much for your leadership in the caucus. And I hope you and your family are well. I do feel that it's a different moment. You have the sense every once in a while that something's happening. I do feel that while the response from the Republicans is not there, it's not there yet, but it's more than zero, and zero is often what we get. So I'm somewhat encouraged by that, and look forward to working with you to see if we can't land this plane. I will see you next week, I guess, and hope we make good progress. And again, thanks so much for your friendship and your leadership.
Thanks for doing this, Scott, and look forward to seeing you next week. Safe travels.
All right, you too. Mary Ann, do we have a new guest, or I can make some comments about some of the things that are going on locally.
Thank you so much. Congresswoman there she
Oh,
is. She was just about to, it looks like her video and audio have both been enabled. Welcome, Congresswoman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on. Appreciate
Hey, Karen,
it. How are you doing, Scott?
I'm great. Nice. And thank you. I heard you on the New Dems call today, and I want to say that I appreciate the enthusiasm and that you approach this with. It's really remarkable that you portray such confidence. And let me just give a little introduction to folks in my district about you. Karen Bass represents the 37th Congressional District in California, which is LA and Culver City. She's in her 5th term in Congress. She came in 1 term before me. She's now the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. She's a member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and the House Judiciary Committee, and was the first African-American female speaker of the state legislature. She preceded our own Tony Atkins by 2, I think. She's played a pivotal and leading role in crafting in the Justice and Policing Act. And I found out that there's a reason for that, because before she was in public office, she worked for nearly a decade as a physician assistant and served as a clinical instructor at USC's Keck School of Medicine Physician Assistant Program, and has a long path in dealing with these justice issues going back to the 90s in Los Angeles. So thank you for joining us tonight, Karen. I was hoping you could share with folks in our district about how the CBC worked to help develop the Justice and Policing Act. Anything you think the people of San Diego should know about the dramatic critical shift we're seeing in how our nation views policing and the need for reform, and the floor is yours. Again,
thank you so much for inviting me to be with your constituents on this town hall. And let me just tell you a little bit, maybe you didn't know, that I went to San Diego State. I was an Aztec for a couple of years. And during that time, San Diego was a different city. Talk about policing, it was a military town. Now it's primarily a beautiful tourist town. I love going to San Diego and everything about your district. I know you don't represent San Diego City, but you're a little bit north of there, but such a beautiful, beautiful part of our state. So the Congressional Black Caucus is 49 years old. Next year will be our 50th anniversary. And when the CBC first started, we only had 13 members. Today we have 55 members, and 3 of our members are in the top leadership of the House. You just had on our great Democratic Caucus chair. I listened to the last few minutes of his presentation, and we are extremely honored and fortunate to have such a talented leader from New York. We also have Jim Clyburn, who is the majority whip, 3rd in line in leadership, and Representative Barbara Lee in Oakland, California, who serves on the Steering and Policy Committee. So members of the Black Caucus, now I'm in my 5th term, as Scott said, but many members have been here for way longer than me and have been working on police issues for literally decades. And so when we compiled the Justice and Policing Act, when our great speaker, after the vicious murder of George Floyd, said we need to act with substance, we need to act immediately. And what she did was she gave me the assignment because I do play a dual role. I chair the Black Caucus, but I also chair the subcommittee that this legislation would come before, which is the Crime Committee and Judiciary. And we looked over bills that members of the Congressional Black Caucus had been fighting for years. I don't know if Chairman Jeffries mentioned that one of his bills is featured very prominently, and that's the bill that outlaws chokeholds. Well, a number of members have been fighting for police reform legislation for many, many years, and we're going to do it because it takes 213 votes right now, because we have some vacancies, to pass a bill, and we have 226 co-sponsors. So I'm confident that we will be able to pass it at the House.
Great. Tell me a little bit about what the Justice and Policing Act does not do. I want to talk about the notion of defunding the police. Sure. What's your feeling about that? How does that play into this whole discussion?
Sure, absolutely. Well, you know, I have to tell you that defunding the police has been absolutely used by conservatives to create a notion that the Democratic caucus wants to eliminate the police or eliminate funding for the police, and nothing could be further from the truth. But what is so important underneath that cry is the fact that our society has divested from the social safety net. We've divested from education. We've divested from mental health services. And when we divest, the problems don't go away. The problems are just left to the police to clean up. And you hear police officers every day of the week complain that they're not social workers. So why are we putting them in this position? And so it's about looking at city budgets, looking at federal resources and saying, should we be spending all of the money this way or should we invest back? Let me give you an example. In Los Angeles, we have a jail that's called Twin Towers. There are thousands of people in that jail. It is the most expensive mental health institution in our country. I remember when we had mental facilities, and we decided that we should close them down and send all of the patients into communities because we were going to build up this safe community-based mental health treatment programs. Well, we never did that. So then we built a far more expensive facility called a jail. And unfortunately, we have decided to criminalize a lot of our problems. So this movement is crying out saying, we need to stop criminalizing problems. We need to invest back in communities, and then you won't have to spend so much on police.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. I do think it's misinterpreted a little bit, and we have a time of great emotion, but it's also a time for thought and working on the problem. And I did hear today on the New Dems call, you talk a little bit about the response of Republicans to this. So maybe you'd be willing to share what you're hearing from the other side of the aisle on this with the constituents in the 52nd, and how you think we get something passed.
Sure, and I don't know, I know that Chairman Jeffries went through parts of the bill, but he may or may not have mentioned the grants to community-based organizations. Did that come up in the prior call?
Just parenthetic, just a little bit, yeah.
Okay, because part of the grant, community-based organizations can apply for federal funding so that they can begin the process of looking at their community to say, what do we need to make our community safe? What are the problems that maybe we need to shift resources to? And so my Republican colleagues now, I'm encouraged because I feel that the bills that they are putting forward, and even the president, it's so interesting to see how they're all stealing the components of our bill, which I think is a good thing. The problem is taking the teeth out of it. And so I don't believe we need to study chokeholds. I don't believe we need a database on no knocks. Breonna Taylor would be alive today, shot 12 times in her sleep with a no-knock warrant. They were looking for drugs. The person they were looking for was already in custody. We need to end those practices. Yeah. So I am very encouraged because I feel like my Republican colleagues are attacking the defund movement and they're attacking rioting. Neither one is in our bill. And so to me, that indicates that there might be room for us to come together.
And of course, I think, I'm sure you're aware that the San Diego Police Department on day one basically said, okay, no more carotid restraint. We never used the chokehold. And the sheriff, even the sheriff followed him a little bit after that, after saying we're going to keep it. I think he heard from people and said, okay, we can do without it. So I think there's good progress within some police departments as well. Let me ask you, I was saying District 52 is not heavily African-American, but we have a lot of people who are interested in helping. And I guess might ask you as the CBC chair, what do allies do to help Black Americans during this time make progress and heal the division in our country?
Well, first of all, let me just say a word about the policing issue, because this is not just a Black issue. This is the Black and the Latino community and the Pacific Islander part of the Asian community as well. So all of us experience violence from police, abuse and inappropriate behavior. And so this is an issue that we come together about. And so when I think of your district, I think of the other people that live there as well, who I know have to experience these parts, especially when you're talking about affluent areas. And, there's a part of my district that's very affluent as well. And sometimes when folks from the other side of my district go to that affluent side, they experience stops. Don't go to Beverly Hills at night if you are Black, because the odds of you being stopped are very high. Now, I have a brother that lives in Beverly Hills, okay? He has to worry about being stopped and worried about being asked, why is he there? Why is he in Beverly Hills? It doesn't occur to them that maybe he lives there. And so I think that helping African Americans and Latinos, one of the most important problems, I think, in our country is that we know very little about our own history. We don't know very much. So let me just tell you something that I think is so harmful, and this is something that everybody can stop doing. What has happened historically before George Floyd is we've seen videotape after videotape after videotape. And I will have people say to me, well, I've never had a problem with police. And in doing that, they will then turn around and essentially negate my experience and say, what's wrong with you? That's never exactly said, but it's like, well, I've never had a problem with police. Therefore, your problem, I'm not sure I really believe. And I think one of the most important things people can do is just listen and say, you know what? That's never been my experience. You're telling me it was yours. Tell me about it. Help me understand, as opposed to a complete rejection and negation. I can't tell you how emotionally damaging that is when what you have gone through every day of your life, what has happened to generations of your ancestors, is negated because somebody hasn't had the experience themselves. Therefore, your experience is not valid and didn't exist.
Right. Have you spoken to Black police officers about how they're managing and feeling, responding to this national reaction? And what's that?
Yes.
What's that like for them?
Black police officers have their own organization, National Association of Black Law Enforcement Officers. And first of all, police culture is police culture, white, Black, brown, Asian. And so sometimes Black police officers fall into the same culture. But Black police officers will tell you in a minute, when they take off their uniform and get in their car, they're subject to police stops and harassment like any other Black person. And sometimes Black police officers on the force are harassed, are threatened by their own colleagues. And one of the ways they're threatened, especially if they're going to say anything about race, is that their colleagues then won't necessarily protect them, or they will threaten that, next time you need a partner, maybe I'll be there, maybe I won't. So the terror that Black police officers have to work under is beyond my comprehension. And they will tell you this. I've had police officers tell me that, again, on one side of my community, my district that is white and very wealthy, police go to that area to protect and serve. The other side of my district is South Central Los Angeles, and police officers have told me that you get younger folks coming out of the police academy going, hey, I want my first assignment to be South Central so I could go down there and kick butt. That's the way you view the community? You're not going to Baghdad. It's not a war. But if you view a community in that way, then why should we be surprised when you abuse people?
Yeah. Mary Ann, maybe some folks have some questions that we can ask of Karen while we have her for another 15 minutes or so.
We have a lot of questions, and she was just speaking about the safety of police officers in particular in her last comments, and I think this one is a good follow along. Joe from Ocean Beach says that he's concerned about both officer and public safety when we are in fact rescinding some tools that the police do use, and when they're used properly and not abused, they are useful to detain violent suspects or those that might be resisting arrest. So he would like to know if you are seeking input from law enforcement about these changes and what they're saying about them.
Well, yes, I have been talking to law enforcement officers almost every day, the chiefs of police, as well as the police unions. But I will raise the question of, are some arrests really necessary? The problem in inner city communities is that they're over-policed because the viewpoint is everybody is a suspect. I mean, take what happened in Atlanta. Why did they need to arrest that man? I mean, his crime was he fell asleep in the line at Wendy's restaurant. Okay, maybe he was intoxicated. Why didn't they go to him and tell him, park your car in the parking lot and get an Uber? He offered to walk home. Now, of course, what he did in resisting arrest was wrong, but you really have to raise the question, why does everybody need to be arrested for every little thing in the inner city when you wouldn't dream of doing that in an affluent area? Do you remember Dylan Roof? Dylan Roof killed 9 people at Temple Emmanuel, Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina. When the police arrested him, they didn't even pull out their guns. He said he was hungry. They got him lunch on the way to the police station. He killed 9 people. This poor man the other day fell asleep in line. So you have to look at, why do so many arrests take place? Who are they arresting people for? How does it compare to the other side of town? Because sometimes what is a crime is looked over in an affluent area, but all guns come out blazing when it's 5 miles away on the other side of town.
Yep. Marianne?
We'll take some more questions. Sure. There's Karen has posted a question. Her name is also Karen. She said that she currently serves on the regional task force on the homeless. And she often laments how our police officers must respond to calls about people experiencing homelessness when she feels very strongly that it really should be social workers and that we need social workers. We got a similar question about people who are officers having to respond to folks with mental health issues. Both of them have asked if we think that those duties should be completely removed from the police departments, or if they should just be filled with people who are better trained in those professions.
How about helping the people to begin with so you don't need to call anybody? How about that? So what Trump did today in his executive order was he called the social workers and all of that, but is not proposing a dime. He says we want to look at maybe shifting resources. It's just like every time there's a shooting, and Scott, I know you know what I'm talking about. Every time there's a shooting, our Republican colleagues say it's a mental health issue. Even if it's a terrorist act. Well, terrorism is defined on the color of the person. If it's a terrorist act, they will say like shooting up a Planned Parenthood. I think that's a terrorist act. They say it's a mental health issue. Scott, tell me one time you've ever seen them propose a dime for mental health.
Right.
And so if you think it's mental health, and I do, then why don't you put money toward that?
Right. Of course, it's a mental health issue. It's been a mental health issue in every shooting since Columbine. What are we going to do about it? And, that's I think, a key thing. Also, by the way, it's a little bit off the topic, but we would certainly help the police by taking some of these, make it hard to buy guns if you're a criminal as well, which I think we're all going to do. Marianne?
Sure. This is from Jerry. I believe this question's from Jerry in Mira Mesa. He said that there is a culture that police officers do not ever correct fellow police officers, if they have bad conduct, and that this culture manifests in a sort of a don't snitch or don't tell on your brethren in the thin blue line, and that there does not seem to be training to fix this toxic culture. He wants to know if there is legislation proposed to fix this and to protect the good cops while also going after the bad cops.
Yes, and so one of the things is to have a national standard and national accreditation. So if you want to go get a haircut, your hairstylist and barber has a license, has an accreditation, has had training. It's standard. Why wouldn't the profession that has the license to kill not be accredited with national standards? But there's also a provision in the bill that requires the duty to intervene. So you've all seen the videotape of the 75-year-old man that was pushed down. Now, the police said he tripped, okay? I was really happy that happened because Black people say that all the time, that the police lie. And a lot of people who've not experienced this, they don't believe the police lie. And we all saw it on TV. When one police officer reached down, and the next time you see the videotape, notice this, reached down to render assistance, the other officer pulled him away. That man is now in the hospital with a fractured skull and is unable to walk. The only thing the president said was, he said he was a 75-year-old member of Antifa. And so there's another videotape that you guys might have seen. This is a young white man in, I forget what state he was in. He was fleeing from police in a car. He got out of the car and he either jumped or fell into a lake. It was at night. The police are looking at him sink in the lake. And one police officer went down to help him and he asked for help. He said, help me. The other police officer pulled him back and said, oh, he just went under. That man drowned.
What's your take on body cameras? Has that been a discussion as part of this? Is it a useful tool?
It was the body camera that took that picture. It was the body camera that took that picture. And so I don't think body cameras are the end all, but I do think body cameras and dashboard cameras are important.
Okay.
I do think if the man from Atlanta was driving drunk, that is absolutely a concern. But being in a takeout line is not driving. The police officers could have taken the man's keys and told him to park.
Yeah. Marianne, we have Karen for about 5 or 8 more minutes. So let's get as many questions as we can.
I will. This is a question that came in several forms from a lot of different people here in the chat. People from all over our district, again, are saying, how do they, as they're not African-American, they believe this is what we're seeing is from police officers, you know, in the George Floyd case in particular and others, is wrong. They don't feel like they are equipped to help. They just want to know what they can do to help. How do they help educate people who have never experienced racism, what it feels like, and what they, as white allies, can be doing to make a difference?
You know what? There is a great documentary on Netflix called 13, the number 13. Please see it. It is incredible. It's about the 13th Amendment. And it tells you about the origins of policing and the criminal justice system. And it relates it to the period of enslavement and goes up until current time. Please watch that. I think that you can do things to educate yourselves and other people. And there's a ton of things that one can watch and read together. You know, it's something, since we're all in this Zoom world, you know, you can have a Zoom while you're watching it together and talk about it, but educating yourselves and sharing it with other friends who say, there's no problem. These people just call the racial card. And I can't tell you how important it is to Black people and other people of color when white allies speak out against racism. To me, it's like every time I hear it, it's like I automatically lose 20 pounds because it's like 20 pounds off my back. And what you don't understand, and this is a sad reality, but you have more credibility than me when it comes to talking about race. Because when I talk about race, it's expected, and I'll be told I'm using the race card. When you talk about race and take a stand, you have validity. But here's something that all of you can do. You can protect Scott Peters, because he has to take hard votes. And this is not going to be a pleasant vote. And he's going to do that because he's one of the co-sponsors of the bill. And you need to understand, when he takes those votes, he's going to get some backlash for it. And I think standing up, making public statements, tweeting, emailing your support for him is very, very important.
That's very kind, Karen. You know, I do think that I've personally come to understand that through discussions I've had with African-American leaders, actually folks I've met in Congress, the fear of police that comes with being African-American. And that's something that we've got to work together to stop. I think that I get nervous about being pulled over by the police, but I'm worried about whether I'm going to get a warning or a ticket. And, and I don't have the experience that people have of real fear. And so I need to understand that. And I think we have to make sure that everyone understands that so that we can change the culture. Mary, we have time for one more, I think.
And then this question has come up several times. In particular, Walter asked this question, and I think I know that you have addressed this a little bit, Congresswoman, but I would love it if you could say it again, because I think it's really important. Several people have asked, how do we talk about these needed reforms in a way that both reassures that people who are concerned with police abuses, that this time we're going to take meaningful action, but also in a way that doesn't frighten people who appreciate that that we need law enforcement. We're not defunding police departments entirely. How do we talk about it in a way that doesn't scare off the people we need to stay behind this movement?
Well, absolutely. I do not believe in any way, shape, or form that this is an anti-police bill. I believe that police officers risk their life every day. As Scott mentioned, I worked in healthcare. Well, I worked in the emergency room right alongside police officers every day. Police officers and firefighters and medical folks are a team. And they don't want to be hated. They don't want to work with corrupt people. They don't want to work with people who are abusive and know then that they can't say anything about it. There's a Black woman, by the way, in New York, actually that same police department where they pushed the 75-year-old guy over. A year or two ago, she intervened with a white colleague who was choking somebody out. It was in a chokehold, and she got fired. She got fired for intervening and was ostracized. I don't think that's the way most police departments want to be. And so to me, this is a bill to assist the police officers while assisting the community at the same time. And there's nothing in this bill that cuts funding to police. Now, it doesn't give new money, but it does not cut any funding. And again, the people who are calling for funding cuts are also calling to look at the priorities of a given city. And I will tell you that when it comes to the fear that you described, Scott, a lot of times people say this strictly in reference to Black men. It is Black women as well. It took me years to overcome the terror of the idea of a police car being anywhere around me, and the notion that maybe I was gonna live through it, even if they weren't even stopping me. Just seeing them was terrifying. And so that shouldn't exist in anybody's community.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I appreciate your leadership, and also your the way you've educated us here in our district. Look forward to working with you. I hope to see you again soon, and hope we can make real progress. I feel good about it. I feel your optimism about getting pretty far down the road and making a change. So I'm with you, and thanks again. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for inviting me, and I'll look forward to the next time I get in your parts town.
Absolutely. Okay. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
I apologize if we didn't get to everybody's questions. For those people, I wanted, it was a really kind of them to join us today, really meaningful to me that they would share their time with us, two of the most prominent African-American leaders in Congress and on this issue. But we have time to chat about what's going on here. I would just say over the past 3 weeks, we've witnessed citizens and communities across the country face deeply upsetting events, and to sort of remind us of the history of racism and the pain and outrage over the mistreatment of Americans has built up over decades. And so I really do feel that this video of George Floyd did make a difference. At the same time, I think the constituents have recognized that police have a hard job, and it's an important job. They are forced to make split-second decisions about life and death. I want you to know that I've reached out to members of the police force and the sheriffs. I've been speaking to them. I spoke to the police chief. I've spoken to community leaders. This is mostly a conversation and policy change that will happen locally. And I think, you saw that maybe if you paid attention to the budget hearing in San Diego last week, where I think they had over 400 people call in. As a city council president, I can tell you, I can't remember when that ever happened on any issue, when you had that much participation. They wanted to express their concern about how we're allocating resources. But there is a role for federal government. I think you've heard a lot about the Justice and Policing Act to set standards, to create transparency, to root out the bad cops, because no one hates a bad cop more than a good cop. And I think as Karen said, this isn't and shouldn't be against the police, but this should be pro-justice. Marianne, I'd be happy to talk with folks if you have questions for us.
A lot of questions for you, Scott. Joshua from East Village, he writes that we've seen in the protests of the degree to which our police departments have become increasingly militarized in their tactics and weaponry. What are your thoughts on taking action to demilitarize our police force? Also, he's asking, I think what he's asking here is, what do you think about putting police review in the hands of an independent board?
So I really don't like the idea of over-militarizing the police. And one of the things that we saw was the Defense Department was selling to local law enforcement extra equipment. I don't think there's any reason to do that, and I've opposed that. That is not something that makes sense for public safety in localities. There is a effort, local effort. I have to remind myself of the name of the ballot measure that's on the ballot, but I was a early endorser of a ballot measure to create more transparency, to have more outside review of police. Again, not to punish police, but to make sure that we're providing more transparency, and that to the extent we have bad police, that we identify them and remove them. So there is a ballot measure you should check out, and Marianne's going to remind me of the name of it very soon.
It's created San Diegans for Justice. It will create a commission on police practices, and I am going to get you the name and put it here in the chat box very soon.
I'm sorry. It's to replace the Community Review Board on Policy Practices. I've endorsed it early on. I've been joined by a number of other local officials, and I think the Police Officers Association, to its credit, is not in opposition.
You mentioned the Police Officers Association, Scott. One of the questions here is from Stephen, and he says that there's a lot of research and information about the role police unions play in protecting officers. Democrats tend to support unions. I think that Republicans tend to support the police unions as well. How can we work with police unions to demand changes and still respect their right to organize?
Yeah, it's a hard conversation. I'm not one of the people who, look, I believe in public sector unions. I think it's healthy to have a group who can come together for wages and benefits. I think we don't begrudge that of other public agency or employee groups. But on this issue, I think some of this will come from outside. Some of this will come from very, very hard conversations. The police need to hear the concerns of the community. They need to be open to reform. They will probably have to go further than their comfort zone would currently allow them. And at the same time, we have to listen to them about what works and what the real problems are. One of the things I've heard, I think is very constructive, is you're asking us as police officers to do all of these things that are really social work. Well, that's very constructive. We have actually a relatively low number of police per population here. I think 12 per thousand. A lot of big cities have twice that amount per thousand. They've asked for more resources, but maybe some of those resources could come in the form of social work and mental health support. I think that would make sense. I think that's a conversation that the city of San Diego will be having. By the way, I have 3 different jurisdictions. So the city of San Diego has a police department. I've spoken with representatives there. The city of Poway uses the sheriff. I've spoken to people there. I have yet to contact the Coronado Police Department, but I will do that in the near future.
So we had Ken ask what you, Scott, what about your life experience makes you feel like you can play a role in fighting for civil rights at this very important time?
It's interesting because my family has been involved in civil rights struggles since I was a kid. Some of you know that my father is a retired minister, Lutheran minister, who fought housing segregation in the suburbs of Detroit. Like in many communities in San Diego back then, if you were Black or Jewish, you weren't allowed to buy a house in certain neighborhoods. And he thought that as a matter of justice and social justice, that was wrong. He fought against that at the time when there was so much unrest in Detroit and riots and fires and so forth in the late 60s. The point where the police officer in our town, our suburban town, said, Pastor Peters, maybe it would be good for you to leave for a week because I think the tensions are high. So that was actually we did a driving trip from Detroit to Washington, D.C. It was my first trip to Washington, D.C. My father was at a convention in the South after Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and met Martin Luther King Sr., who said to my dad, do you have a white church? Is your church made up of white parishioners? And he said yes. And Reverend King, the senior, asked, or Daddy King as they called him, asked if he could come address the congregation. So he came and spoke to our church, and my dad went to the South and spoke to his church. My father always said that that's the way that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. lived his faith, was for social justice. So that's in my background. That's why I've considered myself a civil rights Democrat. I think that that should be part of our American ethic, and I'll always fight for that.
We have a question here about the use of force during the recent protests here in San Diego. Do you agree with the level of force that the police and the sheriffs employed on protesters here in San Diego? Is there anything in the federal legislation that addresses use of force that are non-lethal?
So it's hard for me to judge. I mean, I wish I had been there. I would have a better sense of it. It's hard for me to judge off of the TV. Clearly, what happened in La Mesa was tragic in so many ways, and I know that the one woman was injured by a rubber bullet. She didn't seem personally like she would be any kind of threat at all. So I think that's lamentable. I think the thing that, as I said, a lot of this is local, and so law enforcement in La Mesa should explain this and answer for it. From a federal perspective, I think one of the things we want to do is we want to lift up good policing by providing training about how to police, how to de-escalate. We want to provide certification so that you meet certain minimum standards. You won't get federal support unless you do. We want to impose transparency requirements. One thing is that we wanted to make sure that if there's a bad cop who got fired, he wouldn't just be able, or he or she wouldn't be able to just leave to go to another force. So I think indirectly, there's a lot of ways that the Justice and Policing Act will encourage better behavior. I probably reserve comment on particular incidents just because they're not as obvious as the Eric Floyd or the Eric Garner or the George Floyd issues. It's hard to judge from the TV set.
I'm not sure. This is a tough question to answer, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway. How do we, or how do you, as a congressman, this is a question from, I believe, Shanaz is the name. How do we educate people or how do we change hearts and minds for those people who feel like racism doesn't affect them? How do we convince them that it's not okay and that they need to be part of the solution?
Well, I mean, it is hearts and minds. It's hearts and minds. So on the heart side, I mean, just look at George Floyd, and ask yourself and your neighbors and your children and your parents, is this the kind of society that we want to live in, where law enforcement in our name could do that to somebody? That's a hard side of the question, and to get to know people and have compassion for them, I think that's an important conversation you have to have. It takes time and it takes care and it takes a lot of listening. You can't tell people how to feel, but you can. I think that you can have important conversations that spreads love for everybody. And on the mind side, I mean, just think about how our tax money is being used. I mean, is this really what we want our money to be used for? Is this really the most effective way to provide public safety? And do we need to be killing people and setting off all this unrest? I mean, obviously, we could do better as a voter and as a citizen. I think we must do better. So that's why I'm working as a legislator to do better. But this won't change overnight. I think there are people who will always resist a change. But it's up to all of us to sort of demand and to form the society we want, both in your hearts and in your minds.
Several people have asked about getting to the root causes of a lot of these problems. You mentioned young African American men in particular, or all African Americans being just having distrust of the police, being afraid, and several people here in the chat are suggesting that that we probably need to be doing a better job in education and mental health and addressing poverty. I lost my train of thought for a second. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And what do you think we should be doing to address poverty in the African American community?
I don't know if anybody saw the 60 Minutes on the Greenwood massacre in 2021 in Tulsa. We fashioned, they called it Black Wall Street, where a bunch of people had been very successful in becoming African American doctors and lawyers, and there was some unrest there was an arrest, and there was proposed lynching, and there was some resistance, and ultimately the violence got out of hand, and the whole town was razed. 300 to 300 people were killed. Never an apology. Law enforcement was on the side of the rioters, the white attackers, and that's been cause for reflection for a lot of people. Is how do you? There was successful people. They had done all the right things. They had followed the rules, and they just got wiped out because of racism. And we're still called on 100 years later to figure out how to help create African American wealth, generational African American wealth. They didn't get the same benefits from the GI Bill that we did, and we that a lot of white families were able to pull themselves up, by the proverbial bootstraps, but with the help of the federal government that a lot of people didn't get if they were African American. So we face the same thing today, and I wish I could tell you that it was easy, but we ought to be thinking about how to have more Black-owned businesses. We ought to be thinking about how to have more Black millionaires. We ought to be thinking about how to make sure that we address poverty in underserved areas, so that kids have enough to eat, then they can learn in good schools. It's a tremendous amount of work. It won't happen overnight, but that's really the long-term goal. And when you talk about the land of opportunity, if you don't do that for everyone, that's a bankrupt promise.
So Larry comments that he believes the problems are more systemic and extend beyond the law enforcement and police. What other measures or efforts would you propose or support to address racism in our society? You talked a little bit about it now, but he says, are there economic measures that could help address equality and opportunity?
Yes, well, I mean, again, every city's got to decide where it spends its money. And remember, a lot of this is is local, but the federal government has the ability and the leverage to deal with poverty. It's very, very difficult to move out of poverty in this country, despite the ideal of the American dream. So much of your future is already determined by your zip code. So the federal government has to be engaged in really providing opportunity, making sure that that everyone has a shot. That could be a lot of it is providing food support right now. Make sure that we provide Medicaid for people who need health care. I mean, it's not from a governmental perspective. There's a lot of obvious answers that I think Democrats are trying to pursue. I have to say, not to be too political, but it's pretty apparent we need a president of the United States who understands and acknowledges that these issues are real. He, fancies himself as having only inherited a few $1 million and made it, but he's totally out of touch with the reality that a lot of Americans face of hopelessness, poverty, the inability to get ahead, lack of childcare. All these things are holding folks back. It's only the federal government that can deal with that. So I'm hopeful that we'll have a different president next year, and I think if we do, that person will understand the issue better. But it's going to take a lot of work, and if people want it to be solved overnight, this has been a problem that's been going on for decades and decades. We need to start to commit and stop digging in this hole and get progress soon.
This is a big question, but I know that it's on a lot of people's minds, and it's come up here in different forms, in a few different ways. But what do you think happened between Eric Garner and George Floyd to contribute to this enormous groundswell of support for reform?
I have to say that I struggle with that because I don't understand, looking back, why the reaction to Eric Garner wasn't exactly the same as this. I think I have to rely on my friend Hakeem to say that this is a moment when we were all together. I mean, we weren't running off to work. We weren't running off to restaurants. We were basically home. Even if you were working from home, you were home, like me. And there were conversations about this. I also say, for me, I think people didn't see this as a one-off. They somehow saw that this is more of a problem than we were giving it credit for before. And I feel bad about that because, like I said, Eric Garner was the same thing. There was no ambiguity about that. There was no interaction. There was no fight over a gun or even a taser. That's just blatant murder. It was murder as soon as you saw it. And I'm glad that people are stepping up to say that these people need to be punished, but that's got to be consistent, and that's got to be systemic. That's got to be the reaction. I think that we need to free up good cops to make sure that bad cops are off the force, and to the extent that they commit crimes, that they're accountable for them.
I have a couple people asking about qualified immunity and your feelings on that, and how we do a better job of prosecuting cops that use force in ways they're shouldn't be.
I never practiced criminal law, but qualified immunity is a bizarre concept. And because the concept is that, in general, and I could say it wrong, some criminal lawyer is going to correct me, but in general, whether a police officer is liable for committing for a killing, say, may depend on whether the police officer himself or other police officers understood what the Constitution said. That's a bizarre kind of interpretation of the law. It has provided some leeway for police to make tough decisions. Now, again, I think you don't underestimate how tough the job of being a police officer is. There are situations where you're in great danger, and you have to make quick decisions. People say that without qualified immunity, they'll be afraid to make those decisions. We have to listen to that, but qualified immunity doesn't strike me as the best way to provide that kind of background, I think that I think it's a bizarre doctrine. It's in the bill. It would be eliminated. We know the Republicans have a different view, so it'll be interesting to see how that issue is resolved. But again, it's a bizarre constitutional issue.
Sarah comments here that we know that the officer that killed George Floyd had several complaints against him previously. How can we stop officers like that from continuing to wear the badge?
Well, that's one of the things our bill would do. I mean, that guy had 17 complaints or something going back to, 10, 15 years. And that's the kind of thing that our bill would provide transparency. It would also prevent someone like that from transferring. So, and I think that's a really critical piece. We do know that police officers are a tight group. They depend on each other. They don't want to, they don't want to tell on each other, and that's a natural thing in that culture, but that's not an appropriate thing. And you have to do something from outside that culture to fix it. And the thing we would do is make sure that if you do face that kind of discipline, that that would be reflected in whether you get hired, and you may not get hired by another department if you're dismissed because of something like that. And that would be a good thing.
Someone wished you an early happy birthday.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you.
Lots of people really grateful that we were able to bring your colleagues into this conversation. We have about 5 more minutes. Any closing thoughts? I could give you one more question, but I don't know if you want some time to make some closing remarks.
Well, I would just say, first of all, I was really delighted that Hakeem and Karen would join us. It's one of the great things about being in elected office instead of working in a law firm, which is one of the things I used to do, is I meet people from all over the country with different perspectives. And I think when you meet people in Congress, despite the organizational, institutional dysfunction that happens sometimes, you do meet people who really who are patriots and want to help the country. And that's the situation here. We have a real issue before us that we have to solve. I mean, I just don't think we can turn a blind eye to this anymore. I don't think we can have a whole group of our society just so scared of law enforcement. And that's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of listening. It's going to take, and people want it to happen right away. I've seen some of the comments, this has to stop now. Every one of us is going to have to work to make this stop. And it is a hearts and mind thing. It's talking to your uncle, it's talking to your kids, it's talking to your neighbors, and talking to people who may not agree with you, talking to cops. And let's all figure out how to make it work. I think I'm committed to that now. I think the Democratic caucus is. I do think, although the Republicans offered a response without a lot of teeth, that's so much more progress than we've seen on so many more issues. So I'm optimistic that we'll get some reform, but whatever we do in law is sort of the minimum. We're all going to have to work hard to make sure that the society functions in a way that's just, and that we're kind to each other, and that we care about each other. I think one of the biggest challenges from this presidency is that we're so divided against each other, and you can think of any number of divisions of us versus them. But we're not. When do we stop? When do we stop thinking of ourselves as a country, as a United States of America? We can't be united until we deal with these internal divisions. I'm committed to do that. I thank everyone for being on the call tonight. Thank my colleagues for their leadership, and wish everyone a safe and happy evening. I know we've got a pandemic going on at the same time, which is a health crisis. We've got an economic crisis falling from that. We're working on that too. But be kind to each other, be patient, and if there's something that we can do for you, I hope you'll get in touch with us. You can reach me best on my website, which is scottpeters@at mail.house.gov. My staff is here to help. If you've got suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. I'm really proud to represent this district. It's a huge honor for me. It's a difficult time. It's an important time. So I take the work very seriously, and hope you see that.